Hello, everyone. So, continuing from where we left off, which was truth tables, we are now going to talk about something called conditional statements, covering, the way it's performed in logic, and eventually we'll see how it's related to computer programming. Literally, in all programming languages, conditional statements are a very important concept and help make your programs really branch out and do a lot of interesting things. But in order to first get there, let's understand the basic premise. So, conditional statements are statements that can be written in what's called if. Whoa. Let's change that. If, then form. And we'll see what that looks like in a little bit. Basically, it's just any sentence that starts with if something happens, then, if something, then something. Not necessarily something happens. That's more the programming sense. So, symbolically, we write it out like this. If you have two statements, P and Q, we write it as P, a little arrow, and then Q. So if you see that arrow, it reads as if P then Q, or sometimes we just say P implies Q. So, you can break down conditional statements into two distinct phrases. The first one being the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is the phrase that follows the if in the conditional statement. And then if the hypothesis is true, we arrive at a conclusion. The conclusion is the phrase that immediately follows the then part of the statement. So let's dive into a couple examples and we'll see how this works. So, number one. We want to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion based on this conditional statement. If you live in Nashville, then you live in Tennessee. So the hypothesis, again, is the phrase that follows if. So if you live in Nashville, that means that you live in Nashville is the hypothesis. You live in Nashville. So, after that, we want to identify the conclusion, which is the phrase that follows the word then. So, we have then you live in Tennessee. So, the conclusion is you live in Tennessee. So basically, if our hypothesis is true, if you live in Nashville, we can conclude that you must live in Tennessee. All right, let's look at another example. All right, number 2 says if the sum of the measures of two angles is 90 degrees, then they are complementary angles. So again, hypothesis is what follows the if phrase. So that would be if the sum of the measures of two angles is 90 degrees. So that's what I'm going to write for our hypothesis. The sum of the measures of two angles is 90 degrees. Then the conclusion is what follows the then. So then they are complementary angles. So the conclusion is they are complementary angles. And, that's the basic gist. I'll leave number 3 for you to try on your own. So let's move on to some other types of examples. Now, this is asking us to take each statement and then convert it into if-then form. So our statement is an angle or an obtuse angle has a measure greater than 90 degrees. So let's think we have to break this down into hypothesis and conclusion. So we start out by writing if. So if. Now let's think what makes sense. What part of this statement can be used to conclude some fact? Well, usually the if part is in the beginning of a sentence. So we could say something like, if an angle is obtuse, if an angle is obtuse, well, then we can conclude it has a measure greater than 90 degrees. So then it has a measure greater than 90 degrees. So fairly simple, hopefully not too bad. Let's try out one more. Let's do number 5. So all numbers divisible by 4 are also divisible by 2. If something, then something. So again, the if usually is the first part of the statement. So if a number is divisible by 4, if a number is divisible by 4, then we can conclude it is also divisible by 2. Then it is divisible sorry about that divisible by 2. Okay, that goes over some of the basics of if-then statements. In the next video, we will cover ways we can kind of alter these if-then statements, kind of like how we were doing with the the regular logical statements before these, and the truth tables like conjunctions, disjunctions. It turns out we have sort of a set of operations for these if-then statements as well.